With the upheaval in international relations recently brought by Trump, questions have begun to be asked about the future of the BRICS. Trump recently decreed their death, stating that since he threatened 100% tariffs on those countries that want to abandon the dollar in international trade, the BRICS would have lost their reason to exist. In the same way, the rapprochement of the United States with Russia could lead to the end of the Moscow-Beijing axis, but in the recent meeting between the Chinese foreign minister and the Russian foreign minister at the G20 in South Africa, the two countries reaffirmed their convergence. And there is also another player often overlooked in the international scenario. That is India. The recent developments in the war in Ukraine have overshadowed the meeting between Modi and Trump that took place following Modi's trip to Washington from the 12th to 14th of February. The two leaders reached a joint declaration for the strengthening of trade and defense cooperation. The doubling of trade, energy agreement, F-35 and tariffs were key points of the Trump-Modi talks. The two leaders agreed to raise bilateral trade to $500 billion by 2030, more than double the current volume. New Delhi and Washington also promised to finalize the first phase of the Bilateral Trade Agreement, BTA, a deal that would address existing barriers by the fall of 2025. The issue of trade barriers came to the fore after Trump, on several occasions, labeled India as a major abuser of trade. Notably, hours before meeting Modi, Trump unveiled a plan to increase US reciprocal tariffs to match those imposed by other countries. I have to say that India is imposing a 30, 40, 60 and even 70% tariff on many goods and in some cases much more. The US trade deficit with India is almost $100 billion, and Prime Minister Modi and I agreed that we would engage in negotiations to address the long-standing disparities that should have been resolved over the last 4 years, but have not been resolved in the US-India trade relationship with a view to signing an agreement, Trump said. Trump suggested that an easy way to balance trade would be to increase US oil and gas exports to India, which Washington sees as a means of reducing New Delhi's dependence on Russian oil and gas imports from the Middle East. The Prime Minister and I have also reached a major energy agreement that will re-establish the United States as the leading supplier of oil and gas to India. We will hopefully be their #1 supplier, Trump said without announcing any details. Modi expressed hope that a mutually beneficial trade deal would be finalized, saying India would prioritize oil and gas trade to achieve energy security. On expanding defense ties, Trump said the US would increase arms sales to India and eventually offer its F-35 fighter jets. The countries announced they would accelerate technological cooperation in space, air defense, missile defense, maritime defense, and submarine defense. A new 10-year framework agreement on defense cooperation will be signed this year, the leaders said. But despite the success of this bilateral meeting, contradictions remain in the background that are difficult to resolve. The US's desire for the possibility of offering India's F-35 fighter jets and becoming its main supplier of fossil fuels is in contrast with Russia's leadership position in these areas. India's acceptance of those long-term goals should not be misinterpreted or passed off as anti-Russian, but rather as another example of its multi-alignment between competing poles. India will never turn down friendly offers, but it won't accept to offend anybody either. By always keeping its positions open, India hopes to motivate other partners to offer it even better deals, ultimately deciding which proposal is best for its objective national interests. Problems remain in Indo-US relations. Not least, Trump's demand that Modi drastically lower his country's notoriously high tariffs, as well as the US leaders' continued sanctions on Russian oil, and his threat to modify or cancel his first administration's sanctions waiver for the Iranian port of Chabahar. On February 4th, Trump signed an executive order that it's Iran's Chabahar port project, a key port for the North-South Transport Corridor, NSTC, the multimodal transport line developed by India, Russia, and Iran that links Russia to India and balances China's presence in Central Asia. As per an Indian government report, maritime traffic along that route increased by 43% last year and container traffic by 34%. The surge in maritime activity, including through the Shahid Beheshti port in Chabahar in Iran, also comes as India and Iran signed a 10-year agreement to operate the Chabahar port in May 2024, 8 years after establishing the overall framework for cooperation. Developed as an alternative shipping lane to the Gulf of Aden-Suez Canal route, Chabahar port is also seen by New Delhi as a strategic gateway to unlock India's trade potential with Central Asia, Russia, and European countries. Industry experts believe the NSTC will allow India to bypass Pakistan and gain access to Central Asian markets, where Chinese companies are rapidly establishing their presence. Overall, the NSTC is expected to reduce transit times by 40%, cutting average transit times from 45-60 days to 25-30 days, officials from Russia, India, and Iran said. It is also likely to reduce transportation costs by 30%. Although work on the NSTC began in the early 2000s, it has received renewed attention following Western sanctions against Moscow and, earlier, Iran, and events related to the Middle East crisis that have upended the global shipping industry and increased shipping costs. Trump's proposed modification or revocation of India's Chabahar port sanctions waiver is intended to force Iran to make concessions to the US, as the executive order explicitly calls for the presumption of maximum pressure toward Iran. The future of Iran's economy is even more dependent on the NSTC than India's and Russia's. Hitting it is then a way to exercise pressure by the US to increase the possibility that Iran accept Trump's demand on the issue of nuclear energy. But Trump's move could slow the rapprochement he has sought with India, and could push India to challenge the US by retaliating through increasing oil imports from Russia and trade with Iran. In addition, replacing Russia's leading roles in India's military and energy industries risks forcing Moscow to strengthen its relationship with Beijing. In short, if the goal is to detach Russia from China, the US attempt to increase ties with India could push Moscow to look increasingly towards the east. And hitting China, Russia, and Iran simultaneously is quite difficult, because India has a complex balance with these three countries. As for the relations between China and India, during a personal meeting between Modi and Xi at the BRICS summit in the Russian city of Kazan, it was possible to turn a page in the history of bilateral relations. A complete solution to all the problem is still far away, but immediately after the Kazan summit, both sides withdrew forces from the border and agreed on a patrol programs to avoid future clashes in the disputed areas. At the recent meeting between Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi and Indian National Security Advisor Ajit Doval, the sides agreed on a 6-point program for further cooperation regarding the border. Neither India nor the US want to see China as the sole global superpower and the sole power pole in Asia, but in recent years India has shown that it does not want to blindly support the American strategy. Both China and the US are extremely important to India. Almost all sectors of the Indian economy, from pharmaceuticals to IT, depend on Chinese imports for their work, and the US remains India's most promising export market. Over the past years, there has been a declining trend in foreign direct investment from Western countries in India. India has slipped in the global FDI rankings, with inflows falling by 43% to $28 billion. There are many reasons for this. The problem in the global economy resulting from the Ukrainian conflict, the uncertainty associated with the US elections and the future policy of Donald Trump, and finally, the unrealized hopes of a hard decoupling. To continue the reform programs already started and prevent internal socio-economic problems, the Indian authorities need new investments, and China emerges as an important potential source. In short, although Trump has already decreed the death of BRICS, at the moment this multilateral is the main venue for dialogue between China, Russia and India, and the role of BRICS in shaping the international order does not seem to be exhausted at all. Thanks for watching, I'm Diego and this is 99 Media, an Italian-based collective of journalists, activists, philosophers and artists whose goal is to build a real media for the 99%. If you like this content, please like, share and subscribe to our channel to help us spread through the algorithm. And you may also want to support our work by joining our funding campaign by donating via PayPal or GoFundMe at the links below. Thanks again, and I'll see you all next time.